The old consensus on U.S. foreign policy is dead. Last weekend, President Biden revealed something striking about his reason for wanting to run again in 2024. During his interview for my show on CNN, I put it to him that even some of his most ardent supporters, those who think he has turned the economy around and restored relations with the rest of the world, believe he should step aside and let another generation of Democrats take the baton. I asked, why are they wrong? Biden responded by speaking solely about foreign policy. He argued that the world is facing dramatic change, and that the United States has a unique opportunity to bring together the world's democracies. He insisted that he is succeeding at doing so and that he wants to finish the job. Having spoken to Biden before, I would say that central to his worldview is the belief that the world today is being shaped by challenges from autocratic states, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and that the future will hinge on how the democracies respond to these challenges. Like anyone who wants to be president, Biden has a healthy ego, and he has wanted the job since he was a young man, but I think it's fair to say he is also driven by a sense that the future of the international order is on the line. The stakes are high, and they are made much higher by the fact that, for the first time since the World War II era, the basic issue of America's engagement with the world is becoming a partisan issue. The United States stepped onto the world stage in 1917 to prevent a great power from dominating Europe. In 1945, after World War II, it stayed engaged to ensure peace and stability in Eurasia. But today, as Russia wages a brutal war in Europe that seems a throwback to World War II, there is deep division in America about staunchly opposing that aggression. Consider the numbers. According to a recent Gallup poll, 79% of Democrats want to help Ukraine regain lost territory, even if that means prolonging the conflict. By contrast, 49% of Republicans would like to end the conflict quickly, even if that means letting the Russians hold on to the territories they have acquired by force. On NATO, Democrats approve of it by a wide margin, 76% to 22%, while Republicans are split, with 49% approving and the same number disapproving, according to a Pew Research Center survey conducted in March. On the broader issue of engagement with the world, 60% of Democrats in the same poll said they believe that it's best for the future of our country to be active in world affairs, while only 39% agreed that we should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems here at home. For Republicans, those numbers are essentially reversed, with 71% wanting to focus at home and just 29% believing in an active world role for the United States. This is not a settled issue. There is a debate within the Republican Party. Some senior figures, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Kentucky, and former Vice President Mike Pence, are vigorously making the case for an active and engaged America. But the party's base seems to be with the isolationists, as can be seen in the tilting stances of the weather-vane Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, California. From Donald Trump to his copycat, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and the party's most powerful media ideologist, Tucker Carlson, conservatives are increasingly contemptuous of America's support for Ukraine and its strong alliance with Europe. Senator Josh Hawley, M.O., told the New York Times that although some Republicans remain staunchly interventionist, that's not where the voters are. As the Post's Max Boot has pointed out, some conservatives claim to be against supporting Ukraine but in favor of confronting China. That, as he notes, is because China is an economic foe, run by the Communist Party. But this also has to do with the fact that many conservatives are not interested in an engaged foreign policy. They're focused on building tariffs and walls, subsidizing domestic industry, raising xenophobic suspicions about Chinese students and Chinese Americans, and giving the Pentagon even bigger budgets. This is a reprise of the old Jacksonian foreign policy of a fortress America. The Republican Party might be returning to its roots. It bitterly opposed the United States' entry into World War II, until Pearl Harbor. Even after the war, many Republicans opposed NATO and U.S. engagement with the world, even though they were strong anti-communists. Then, as now, they claimed to want to focus on China. Dwight D. Eisenhower offered not to run against Senator Robert A. Taft, the leading Republican of his day, if Taft would endorse NATO. Taft refused, so Eisenhower ran to preserve the United States' engagement with the world and the international peace and stability that it brought. Alas, there is no Eisenhower to redirect the Republican Party today, and the stakes are as high as they were in 1952, if not higher. As we look around the world, we see that the single biggest risk to the international order may lie not in the killing fields of Ukraine or across the Taiwan Strait, but rather on the campaign trail in the United States. Inflation is down. The Fed still needs to finish the job. The Consumer Price Index rose by only 3% during the past 12 months. President Biden is taking a victory lap, saying inflation has dropped for 12 months straight. That interpretation is debatable, given the variety of ways inflation is measured. Prices rose more in June than they had in May. But there's a clear enough downward trend that the Federal Reserve is already hearing calls to declare its own victory over inflation, rather than continue to raise interest rates until it achieves its stated goal of bringing the inflation rate down to 2%. Although the case for relenting is not frivolous, the Fed should stay the course. Even before the government released the latest inflation number, Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, asked, "Do we want to sacrifice the economy to the altar of the 2% inflation rate?" He suggested that a 3% inflation rate might be tolerable. We should give Zandi props for bringing to mind the closing line of William Jennings Bryan's 1896 protest against tight monetary policy, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." But Zandi's argument has more than rhetorical resonance going for it. The 2% goal is arbitrary. A stray remark by a New Zealand official is generally thought to have begun the chain of events that led to the goal becoming orthodoxy for central banks around the world. Zandi is right that relatively steady, predictable, and low inflation matters more than the exact target rate. A steady 3% inflation rate would even have some advantages over a lower one, such as raising nominal interest rates and thus giving central banks more room to maneuver. That's why 22 prominent economists wrote a letter to the Fed in 2017 urging it to consider a higher inflation target. And if we were designing a monetary policy from scratch, we might well pick a 3% target. But we're not. There's a history we have to consider. The Federal Reserve let inflation run out of control from the late 1960s through the early 1980s, and then painfully wrung that inflation out of the economy through interest rate hikes that led to double-digit unemployment. It drove inflation lower and eventually settled on the 2% goal, which was formally adopted in 2012 but has arguably been in place since 1995. The current inflationary episode is the most serious one we have endured since the recession of the early 1980s. The Fed was late to respond to it but has done so notwithstanding political pressure. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat Massachusetts, said last year that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome H. Powell was trying to engineer a brutal recession. So far there is little evidence of brutality. The unemployment rate is 3.6%, lower than it was at any point from the presidency of Gerald Ford through that of Barack Obama and exactly where it was when the Fed started raising interest rates last year. The labor force participation rate among Americans in their prime working years has increased during this tightening cycle, making the low unemployment rate, which counts everyone who is actively looking for work, even more impressive. Tightening has led to far less economic damage than its critics, or even some of its supporters, predicted. For Powell and his colleagues to abandon the 2% goal now would be to signal that they will flinch even in the absence of pain. If they should err again, as they did in 2021 and 2022, and inflation again rises, they will then have placed themselves in a terrible position. Let's say inflation hits 5%. How much credibility would the Fed have in pledging to do what it takes to hit its new 3% goal? Speculation that it would settle for 4 would be widespread. To convince markets that the Fed really means what it says would then require extra tightening. The Fed would be left with the same painful choice it faced in the late 1970s, let inflation keep drifting higher, or stop it through, well, a brutal recession. The pressure on the Fed is going to increase. But it should stick with the 2% goal. Its job isn't done. McConnell built a conservative Supreme Court. Why doesn't he want you to know? Mitch McConnell wants you to know, the court that McConnell built, the Senate Minority Leader is, more than anyone else, responsible for its current configuration, is an unremarkable, by-the-books institution. In McConnell's telling, the court is an ideologically unpredictable body that produces diverse outcomes, and, he says, the numbers back him up. You've heard about damned lies and statistics. The maxim applies to the Supreme Court, too. The Kentucky Republican is using numbers to try to sand the edges off a hard-right court, and the most intriguing thing about his argument, made in a recent Post op-ed, is that he felt compelled to make it at all. Building a conservative-dominated federal judiciary has been McConnell's passion project, but his greatest passion is achieving, or, in this circumstance, regaining, power. With control of the Senate up for grabs next year, McConnell must be worrying about whether the court's actions, in particular its overruling of Roe v. Wade, are taking a toll on his chances of retaking the chamber and again becoming majority leader. Because that is the best explanation for why McConnell is choosing to minimize the enormity of his accomplishment, his transformation of the Supreme Court from a wobbly center-right institution into a far more conservative, at times aggressively radical, body. Under McConnell's no-holds-barred stewardship, Justice Antonin Scalia was replaced, not by President Barack Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, but by President Donald Trump's, Neil M. Gorsuch. Justice Anthony M. Kennedy retired to make way for Brett M. Kavanaugh. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died just before the 2020 election, and McConnell muscled through her replacement, Amy Coney Barrett. The bottom line, one significant shift to the right, Kavanaugh, and one mammoth one, Barrett. Two seats that should have gone to Democratic presidents were instead handed to Trump. Thank you, Senator McConnell. And the new justices delivered. Abortion rights, gone. Affirmative action, gone. Gun rights, dramatically expanded. The administrative state, deconstruction underway. Religious liberties, triumphant, separation of church and state, not so much. Does this sound ideologically unpredictable to you? What a difference 5 years makes, Justice Sonia Sotomayor observed, dissenting from the six-justice conservative majority's ruling in favor of a Christian website designer opposed to making websites celebrating the marriage of same-sex couples. Sotomayor's point is undeniable, yet McConnell prefers to blur it, and to obscure with statistics that assign equal weight to cases of dramatically varying importance. One Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, wiping out constitutional protection or abortion rights, or one Students for Fair Admissions versus President and Fellows of Harvard College, eliminating the use of racial preferences in college admissions, matters a whole lot more than a slew of more technical, less ideologically freighted decisions. Let's pause to give McConnell's argument its modest due here. This term looked different from its predecessor. There were fewer 6-3 opinions in which the six-justice conservative majority was arrayed solidly against the three remaining liberals. 3 of the 6 conservatives, Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr., Kavanaugh and, to a lesser extent, Barrett, proved themselves unwilling to adopt positions as extreme as their even more conservative colleagues. Some radical positions advocated by red states, Alabama's contention that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional, North Carolina's bid to get the court to adopt a broad reading of the independent state legislature theory, Texas' effort to stop the Biden administration from setting immigration enforcement priorities, turned out to be bridges too far even for this court. And as much as the conservative justice's legal philosophy meshes nicely with the Republican Party's political agenda, there remains a difference between partisanship and ideology. The conservatives aren't solidly, in the tank for Trump. But McConnell badly overstated his case. Evidence from this past term indicates that the court's defining characteristic isn't polarization, he wrote. It is, instead, a politically unpredictable center. This could scarcely be more misleading. Once upon a time, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, I covered a center-right court that could be accurately described that way. Justices Sandra Day O'Connor, David Souter and Kennedy staked out that ground. The last 2 terms have witnessed the dismantling of their most important handiwork, preserving the right to abortion and upholding the use of race as a factor in college admissions. Roberts, Kavanaugh and Barrett are not centrists, not even close. They are committed conservatives who happen to occupy the center of a court that has veered dramatically to the right. Liberal victories are few and far between, and they largely consist of being able to persuade a few conservative justices to keep the status quo in place, not taking the law in any expansive new direction. McConnell might not want you to understand that, but you should, and, McConnell notwithstanding, you should vote accordingly. Trump came to Helsinki to kowtow to Putin. Biden came to stand up to him. If you want to know the differences on national security between Democrats and MAGA Republicans, it all boils down to one word: Helsinki. 5 years ago, on July 16, 2018, President Donald Trump met in the capital of Finland with Russian President Vladimir Putin. There he delivered what Senator John McCain called one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory. Standing next to Putin at a news conference, Trump refused to condemn Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election or even to admit that it had occurred. This came a little more than a year after Trump had attended a NATO summit in Brussels at which he refused to affirm the alliance's Article 5 collective security guarantee. He later reluctantly endorsed Article 5 but continued to criticize the alliance relentlessly. On Thursday, President Biden visited Helsinki for a very different purpose. He came not to kowtow before Putin but to stand up to him, and not to undermine NATO but to strengthen it. This visit was meant to celebrate Finland's recent accession to membership in the alliance, and it came shortly after Biden's attendance at a NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, where the alliance showed greater unity than at any time in recent history. Ukraine did not get a timeline for joining the alliance, but Sweden broke through the Turkish roadblock to its membership, and the Allies signaled resolve in aiding Ukraine and bringing it closer to the alliance. "I've been doing this a long time. I don't think NATO's ever been stronger," Biden said during a meeting with Finnish President Sauli Niinistö. He's right, and he deserves a world of credit for that achievement. Biden has shown more skill at marshalling an international coalition than any U.S. president since George H.W. Bush during the 1991 Gulf War. Biden has often dragged his feet on aid to Ukraine for fearing of triggering World War III, but over and over again he has done the right thing in the end, supplying everything from Stinger and Javelin missiles to M777 howitzers to HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems to Patriot air defense batteries to Bradley fighting vehicles to cluster munitions. Abrams tanks are on their way but haven't arrived yet. One hopes that Army tactical missile systems, Gray Eagle drones and F-16s will not be far behind. It's safe to say that none of that would have happened if Trump had still been in the White House. Just this week, Trump expressed opposition to Biden's decision to provide Ukraine with cluster munitions, a type of munition that the Russians have used in abundance. Trump argues that Biden is dragging us further toward World War III by sending cluster munitions to Ukraine and boasts that he could end the war in a day. To which former Vice President Mike Pence replied, "The only way you'd solve this war in a day is if you gave Vladimir Putin what he wanted." Pence's criticism of Trump is a reminder that most Republicans have not gone weak-kneed on Russia. Aid to Ukraine has passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress. But there is a large and growing faction in the GOP that is hostile to U.S. global leadership and to assistance for Ukraine. A recent Pew Research Center poll showed that 44% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents said the United States is sending too much assistance to Ukraine compared to only 14% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents. The MAGA Republicans would rather wage culture wars at home than support Ukraine's war of territorial defense against Russian aggression. Members of the House Freedom Caucus are offering amendments to the defense authorization bill making its way through Congress, demanding that the United States cut back or eliminate aid to Ukraine and even leave NATO. Meanwhile, the Marine Corps is now without a confirmed commandant for the first time in 164 years because Senator Tommy Tuberville, Republican Alabama, has put a hold on hundreds of nominations for senior officers to protest a Pentagon policy enabling service members and their families to travel to states where abortion is legal to have the procedure performed. To be sure, most of the GOP wants to expand defense spending and continue aiding Ukraine. But Trump speaks for the party's resurgent neo-isolationist wing, and he is the prohibitive frontrunner for its 2024 presidential nomination. Even most of the Republicans who disagree with the former president refuse to call him out for fear of backlash from the Republican base. Trump's leading challenger, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, was once a conventional, Reagan-style conservative on defense and foreign policy, but he is trending toward Trump-style isolationism. The very real possibility that Trump could win back the presidency in 2024 fills U.S. allies with dread, and offers hope to U.S. enemies. John Bolton, who was Trump's national security advisor, has said Trump came close to pulling out of NATO in 2018 and would do so if elected to another term. It's also a good bet that Trump would try to stop the flow of U.S. weapons to Ukraine. Indeed, the very prospect that Trump could return to office encourages Putin to prolong the conflict. Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia and vice chairman of Putin's Security Council, said in May that Trump is a good guy but cowardly and that, historically, it has always been easier to work with Republicans. Medvedev acknowledged that, from the Kremlin's perspective, the main thing is that Biden, the guy with dementia, not win re-election. So, if you believe in making America, rather than Russia, great again, it's imperative for Biden to win in 2024 and maintain the policies that have so greatly strengthened NATO and Ukraine. As long as the MAGA wing remains as strong as it is, Republicans cannot be trusted on national security policy. Neither Trump nor DeSantis will get the GOP nomination. Inevitably, there comes a rebellion against inevitability. Voters have been told that Donald Trump is the all-but-inevitable Republican nominee and that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, operating atop a mountain of cash, will inevitably be Trump's only significant challenger. Voters, however, become contrary when told that the game's outcome is known in the top of the first inning. Hence what G.K. Chesterton called the game of cheat the prophet. People listen politely to explanations of what is inevitable, then make something else happen. The 2024 Republican nomination question was supposed to be, could anyone harpoon the great orange whale? Who knew that he would harpoon himself, repeatedly? Or that DeSantis, playing Captain Ahab, would pay Trump the sincerest form of flattery by imitating his persona as an unhappy warrior? The nation is dispirited by the prospect of an all-too-familiar binary choice, between Joe Biden and Trump. Republicans might soon recoil from another, between Trump and DeSantis. Both candidacies are brittle. Trump, as stale as a month-old crust of sourdough, is running to win the 2020 election. His crybaby crusade might cause even his star-spangled supporters to wonder how to square their proclaimed love of the nation with their hero's insistence that it is so saturated with corruption that his landslide win could be erased without a peep from courts. Including some with his, how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless judge, appointees. Trump's self-harpooning includes expressing contempt for Iowa's popular governor, Kim Reynolds, because she refuses to endorse him, even though he alone, he says, is responsible for her election. And he is too grand to appear with rival candidates at events, perhaps even the August 23 debate in Milwaukee. In the 1980 campaign, Ronald Reagan, who was not considered the inevitable GOP nominee, made only 8 Iowa campaign appearances, spending a total of 49 hours in the state, according to Stephen F. Haywood's The Age of Reagan, The Fall of the Old Liberal Order, 1964 to 1980. And Reagan skipped the Des Moines Register's January 5 debate, which 58% of Iowa voters watched. Voters do not dislike inevitabilities more than they dislike politicians who seem to feel entitled to special dispensations. Reagan's post-debate support plummeted from 50% in November to 26% a week before the caucuses, which he lost to George H.W. Bush. DeSantis, after nearly 2 months of intensified exposure to non-Floridians, resembles a political Edsel. That was the new car model that debuted to much fanfare in 1957, backed by Ford's marketing might. It expired in 1959, becoming a byword for disastrously misreading consumers. DeSantis is running hard to be president of Iowa, or of that minority of Iowans who will vote in the January caucuses and think Trump is ideologically squishy, example, regarding wokeness, and insufficiently abrasive, example, regarding gay rights. The Republican nomination contest is accelerating, as is Ukraine's counteroffensive, the latter underscoring the stakes of the former. During Spain's civil war, a rebel general boasted that he had 4 columns marching on Madrid and a 5th column in Madrid, meaning supporters of the army's insurgency. Vladimir Putin's 5th column is not in Kiev but in the Trump-DeSantis faction of the Republican Party. Putin has 2 hopes for a less than completely mortifying rescue from his Ukraine blunder. One is the election of Trump, whose frivolousness about national security complements his weakling's admiration for a bully. Putin's other hope is the election of DeSantis, who says, or said, before retreating when criticized, Russia's attempt to erase a European nation is a territorial dispute. And whose pandering to Trumpkins prevents him from denouncing House Republicans who are as eager to abandon Ukraine as they would have been to abandon Czechoslovakia in 1938. A New Hampshire student, referring to the January 6, 2021, riot that followed Trump's incendiary harangue and disrupted the certifying of electoral votes, asked DeSantis last month whether Trump violated the peaceful transfer of power. DeSantis' less than courageous answer: "I wasn't anywhere near Washington that day. I have nothing to do with what happened that day." Good grief. He wasn't anywhere near Gettysburg in July 1863 and had nothing to do with the moon landing in July 1969, but that does not preclude him from having thoughts about these events. Political prophecy is optional folly, but there are not enough Republicans, in Iowa or the nation, enamored of the snarling contest between Trump and DeSantis, their competition to see who can despise the most American defects, to nominate either of them. Which is grim news for President Biden. That missing Republican witness is on the lam. The Republicans who claim to be investigating President Joe Biden's alleged corruption evidently can rely on the infinite patience of the American media and their own voters. Week after week they promise new and damning evidence, to be delivered by highly credible witnesses. And so far, every time, the results are embarrassing not to Biden, but to them. Consider the highly credible witness touted repeatedly over the past several months by Representative James Comer, Republican Kentucky, the House Oversight Committee chairman. That's the same witness, described as a whistleblower by Comer, who mysteriously went missing months ago, leading some skeptics to doubt his existence. He does in fact exist, although at this point some Republicans may wish that he didn't. The mystery man is Gal Luft, a 57-year-old dual citizen of the United States and Israel who ran the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, a Maryland think tank, and who also appears to have dabbled in illegal arms sales and covert assistance to Chinese influence operations. Such dubious activities were Luft's side hustles, at least according to a federal indictment unsealed this week. He has been missing because he is a fugitive after skipping bail while awaiting extradition from Cyprus, where he was arrested last April. The Justice Department has charged Luft with a startling list of offenses. He is alleged to have operated as an illegal foreign agent, notably by attempting in 2016 to secretly recruit and pay, on behalf of principals based in China, a former high-ranking U.S. government official who was advising Donald Trump, aiming to shape the president-elect's policy decisions. Prosecutors also accused Luft of seeking to broker illicit arms transactions with Chinese dealers and of attempting to break sanctions on Iranian oil by marketing it as Brazilian oil. They also say he lied on multiple occasions to federal agents. Luft denies everything and claims to have fled because he doesn't believe he can get a fair trial in New York, where the indictment was filed. He also insists that the Justice Department only charged him to block his supposedly damning testimony against President Biden and his son Hunter Biden before Comer's committee, cries of political persecution that congressional Republicans have echoed. Yet while the Justice Department unsealed its charges against Luft on July 10, the original indictment was filed last fall, before Republicans gained control of the House. The investigation must have begun many months earlier. So as Philip Bump observed in the Washington Post, the actual sequence of events was not that prosecutors charged him after his public accusations against the Bidens drew right-wing attention, but exactly the opposite. He went after the Bidens following his indictment and is brazenly using the Republicans to escape a trial and possible conviction that could send him to prison for decades. Not surprisingly, Comer played his role as the useful idiot in that strategy with enthusiasm. He and other Republicans have loudly demanded that the Justice Department grant immunity to Luft so that he can return to Washington to recite his smears in a public hearing. They don't care what serious crimes he may have committed against the United States so long as he advances their partisan agenda. And the same media outlets proven to have consciously lied about the 2020 election are now promoting Luft's revelations. What would Luft say after he receives immunity? Nobody knows, but if his testimony resembles the last big reveal touted by Comer, it won't amount to much. Remember the informant who allegedly reported a claim by a Ukrainian energy executive that Biden had taken a bribe? That executive turns out to have been Mykola Zlochevsky, boss of the infamous Burisma firm that had hired Hunter Biden. But Zlochevsky informed Rudy Giuliani years ago in no uncertain terms that his company had never obtained any assistance of any kind from Joe Biden. No one from Burisma ever had any contacts with VP Biden or people working for him during Hunter Biden's engagement, Zlochevsky said. After all of this congressional clowning at taxpayer expense, the Republicans still have nothing on Joe Biden beyond the sad misconduct of his surviving son. They possess no evidence that he accepted a bribe, no evidence that he did anything illicit or untoward on behalf of foreign interests, and no evidence that his public service was in any way compromised. But the lack of proof won't discourage them from slandering him every day from now until November 5, 2024. Not even a little. If we avoid a recession, we can thank Black and Hispanic workers. The U.S. labor market is on a gravity-defying streak. The June jobs report was a tad softer than expected, but the overall trend is so strong that recession fears are fading. Hiring remains solid across many industries, including construction, and companies are largely holding on to their workers. There's growing optimism that the country can avoid a downturn. One key reason this is possible is the surge of new workers. Nearly 4 million more people are employed now than just before the pandemic hit. That's more families with steady incomes to spend, which helps explain the vigorous sales of everything from cars to gardening supplies. There has also been a big upshift in the labor force since the pandemic. Low-paying hospitality employment still hasn't recovered, as workers have traded up to higher-paying business, healthcare, and warehouse work. This has brought another boost to incomes and an important mental shift as more workers who used to hop from job to job now see themselves on a steady career path. The mistaken notion that Americans don't want to work can now be put to rest. Nearly 81% of Americans ages 25 to 54 are working, the highest share since 2001. What has been particularly jaw-dropping is how resilient job gains have been since March 2022, when the Federal Reserve started aggressively hiking interest rates. Back then, Fed Chair Jerome H. Powell argued the labor market was unhealthy. There was a misguided belief that it would take a recession to get supply and demand for goods, and workers, back to more normal levels. But what many experts missed was how many workers of color and immigrants wanted to work and were still looking for opportunities. Fewer white people are employed now than pre-pandemic. In contrast, over 2 million more Hispanics are employed now, over 800,000 more Asian Americans and over 750,000 more African Americans. This same trend played out just before the pandemic. Companies were also complaining then that they could not find workers, and experts were saying the nation was at full employment. Yet month after month, Black and Hispanic people, largely women, kept entering the labor force and getting jobs. It's also notable that over 2 million more foreign-born people are employed now than before the pandemic. This means that more than half of the new workers have been immigrants. If the U.S. economy ends up having a soft landing, it will largely be because immigrants and people of color have kept entering the labor force, helping to keep production going, consumption solid and wage growth, and inflation, cooling to a more sustainable level. What's going on is partly a result of low unemployment, what economists often dub a tight labor market. Black and Hispanic people often do not get hired until late in a recovery. In the past year, there has also been a strong uptick in jobs in government and health care, sectors in which women of color have historically found employment opportunities. Employers have also expanded their hiring searches, improved pay and benefits, and removed requirements for college degrees for many positions. All of this has helped expand opportunities. This past spring, for the first time, Black Americans were as likely to be employed as white Americans. There is sufficient demand that employers aren't discriminating. They need workers, economist William Spriggs told me in a conversation shortly before his death last month. Spriggs spent years pointing out that too many experts were overlooking how many more people of color were ready to work if only employers would give them a chance and the jobs weren't dead-end ones. As other economists were stunned by the labor market in recent months, especially the gains for Black people, Spriggs had a different take. It's not that the labor market is overheated, he said. It's that the labor market is getting closer to how it's supposed to work in a textbook. All of this suggests experts still don't fully understand what full employment is or how much more labor supply is out there. Policymakers have spent significant time trying to understand why so many white men no longer work. Their labor force participation has been declining for 70 years. It's still important to look for ways to stop that, but policymakers also need to look at how to get more women, especially women of color, working. Women have already demonstrated, time and again, that they want to work more. The U.S. labor force is more diverse today than ever. As baby boomers retire, they are being replaced by younger workers, especially workers of color. Non-white people now make up more than 40% of the labor force. That's almost double the 1990 level. There has been a steady rise in workers of color as the American population has diversified, but the workforce trend accelerated somewhat during the pandemic. No one wants to see the gains for Black and Hispanic workers backtrack. But it's equally important to ask, how many more people could find jobs? And why aren't policymakers trying to find out? Biden is quietly reversing Trump's sabotage of Obamacare. Slowly but surely, President Biden is repairing the U.S. healthcare system, reversing Trump-era sabotage and ensuring millions more Americans get access to affordable coverage. The latest of these efforts came on Friday, in a little-noticed but significant decision to protect Americans from junk health insurance. In 2017, Congress repeatedly tried and failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act. To casual observers, it might have looked like the end of the Republican fight to kill this life-saving, inequality-fighting, newly popular law. It wasn't. Over the next few years, President Donald Trump found new ways to sabotage the healthcare system and its protections for the most vulnerable Americans. Among the most insidious of these backdoor repeal measures, expanding, short-term, limited-duration health plans, i.e., attempting to trick Americans into plans that looked cheap but basically covered nothing. Short-term plans are theoretically intended as brief, stopgap coverage, say, to tide over a new college grad whose job doesn't start until the fall. They're relatively unregulated, they don't have to cover minimum care benefits guaranteed by Obamacare and other major legislation, for example. A 2018 analysis found that most don't cover maternity services, substance abuse care, or prescription drugs. These plans can also deny coverage for care of pre-existing conditions, even if the pre-existing condition in question hadn't yet been diagnosed at the time the person enrolled. People often don't realize they've bought a worthless product until it's too late, when they get hit by a bus, say, or are diagnosed with a brain tumor. Such loopholes might seem like no big deal until you find yourself falling through one. The Trump administration made sure more people did by allowing these allegedly short-term plans to last as long as 364 days, rather than the 3-month max that had been in place, and to be renewed for up to 3 years. This made them look a whole lot like regular plans. Plus, because short-term plans are mega profitable for insurers, brokers can get much larger commissions for steering hapless customers into them. So, many did. Exactly how many were lured by this policy change is unclear. The data is lousy, precisely because these products are so unregulated. A recent estimate from the Urban Institute ballparked the number of people enrolled in individual plans that are non-compliant with Obamacare protections at 2.5 million. The proliferation of short-term junk plans affects even consumers who don't get duped by them. That's because these cheaper plans disproportionately siphon healthier, i.e., lower cost, people out of the broader individual insurance marketplaces. People who have chronic conditions or otherwise know they will need more substantial coverage are more likely to stay in the regular marketplace pool, driving premiums there ever higher. Last week, however, the Biden administration announced a rollback of this Trump-era expansion of short-term health plans. In a proposed rule, Biden officials said those already in these skimpy Trump-blessed plans can continue in them, if they so choose. There were some hard lessons learned from the "if you like your plan you can keep it" blowback a decade ago, surmises Georgetown University health scholar Sabrina Corlett. But going forward, any new, short-term, limited-duration plans would need to be truly short-term, up to 3 months, and truly limited duration, renewed for up to 1 additional month only. Critically, short-term plans must also provide clearer language about what care they do and don't cover, and under what circumstances. People who choose to buy junk must know upfront that they're buying junk. The White House has marketed this rule as part of Bidenomics, though it might be more easily understood as simply pro-consumer. It also dovetails nicely with other actions the administration has taken to expand access to coverage, including outreach to encourage eligible Americans to enroll in marketplace plans and patching the so-called family glitch, a regulatory accident that had blocked a lot of families from accessing subsidized health coverage. Most important, through last summer's Inflation Reduction Act, Biden extended the enhanced premium tax credits available for plans on the individual marketplace. This has meant that millions more Americans can get solid healthcare coverage that not only is affordable but also, in many cases, has an out-of-pocket premium of $0. And unlike with those junk insurance plans, the low price tag here isn't a red flag. These plans actually do provide comprehensive coverage, including for people with pre-existing conditions. It's not a bait-and-switch. It's a real subsidy, and one that will likely drive down premiums overall, on average, by drawing more healthy people into the broader marketplace risk pool. Our healthcare system is still kludgy. It still allows too many Americans to fall through the cracks. But small unsung fixes such as this are achievements worth celebrating. How the myth of a model minority works to divide Americans. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about Bobby and Annie, 2 of my high school classmates from 30 years ago. They used these American names instead of their given names. Bobby, whose given name I never knew, is of Japanese descent. Annie, whose given name I always knew, is the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants. By any names, they are both Americans, born and bred. It was the early 1990s, and I wondered why so many Asian American students picked new names. We grew up in North Carolina at a time when elementary school teachers wheeled out big TVs on steel media carts so we could watch college basketball in our classrooms. We could pronounce the name of Duke University's former coach, Mike Krzyzewski, before we could tie our shoes. If we could say all those consonants, then we could say Annie's given name. Meanwhile, Black Americans were becoming more creative with their names, and, let me tell you, Katedria wasn't changing her name to Kate for anyone. In this roundabout way, Bobby and Annie taught me about the model minority myth. Bobby was the smartest kid in physics class, and had applied to some of the nation's most prestigious universities. One of our jealous classmates taunted him ruthlessly about it, especially any time Bobby didn't get the highest grade on an assignment. The two bickered constantly, but whenever Bobby started to get the best of him, the other kid would flatly reply, Hiroshima. Nagasaki. Annie sat behind me in French class, and we became fast friends. It wasn't long before she noticed the college admissions process was stressing me out, and she made it her mission to lift my spirits. We celebrated the good news whenever it arrived, and she took the sting out of the bad when it showed up in a thin standard envelope. After I showed her a rejection letter one morning, she waved it off, saying, "In the Chinese zodiac, you were born in the year of the rabbit, the luckiest sign. Something better is coming." Annie and I reconnected a while back on social media. A few months later, her elderly father was beaten while out for a walk, the victim of a hate crime. They've been on my mind after the Supreme Court's ruling last week that effectively ended race and ethnicity-based affirmative action in college admissions. The suit was filed on behalf of Asian American students who claimed such programs discriminated against them. The term model minority does not show up in the court's opinion, but the myth helps in understanding why affirmative action was destined to pit Asian and Black Americans against one another. It was always going to end this way. The model minority myth is the idea that Asian Americans, relative to other people of color in the United States, have a stronger commitment to hard work and determination that has resulted in economic and academic success. It says they acculturate better and with more intention. The myth suggests that Bobby and Annie felt compelled to choose familiar American names to ease their acculturation into white American society. But what of the taunting and beating? If this is how the nation treats its model minorities, what hope is there for the rest of us? This myth is a recent invention. Asian Americans, admittedly an inaccurate catch-all group name, were long subjected to discriminatory policies in the United States. Historian Ellen Wu describes the characterization of Asian Americans and immigrants, specifically from Japan and China, through the 1940s and 1950s as definitively not white. But as the geopolitical interests of the nation evolved after World War II and the civil rights movement domestically took center stage, she says, a narrative emerged that painted Asian Americans as the model minority, a racial group distinct from the white majority, but lauded as well assimilated, upwardly mobile, politically non-threatening, and definitively not black. Perceptions of Asian Americans changed just as the concept of colorblindness was redefined in American discourse. When Asian people were definitively not white, the idea of a colorblind society was the antithesis of the hierarchical society structured with white people at the top. As the civil rights movement began racking up policy wins, Asian Americans were redefined as model minorities and colorblind came to mean race is no longer a factor. As such, race-conscious remedies are the new racism. By the late 1960s, many white politicians were using the model minority concept in two primary ways. The first was as proof that the government had sufficiently addressed racism in our laws and that the playing field was now level. What else could explain how Asian Americans, after decades of overt discrimination and oppression, achieved such success? The second was an explicit counterargument to civil rights leaders who insisted tailored, race-conscious policies were necessary to address the lingering effects of slavery and Jim Crow. It made black people the polar opposite of the model minority, shifting the onus for racial disparities almost completely onto black people and their supposed lack of initiative and ingenuity. Following this thinking through to its logical conclusion, the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling is not surprising. Its portrayal of Asian Americans as model assimilators is not a compliment, nor is it proof that structural racism is an artifact of the past. This portrayal serves only to exploit one minority group, to condemn others and to argue against accounting for a people's history. The legal arguments for and against affirmative action in higher education will continue. Universities will try new ways of diversifying their populations, and begrudged people will sue. The model minority myth is sure to be a weapon in these battles. But policy aside, the myth cannot escape the particularly ugly set of assumptions that results when American exceptionalism meets racial hierarchy. If you are black in America, you can become an exceptional person. If you are Asian in America, you are an exceptional people. And if you are white in America, you are the prototype. We've been working ourselves away from that America for some time, but we risk returning to it if we trade one set of racialized myths for another. How Biden learned to stop apologizing and love the economy. Something has come over President Biden and his White House. Rather than talking about the economy in their usual tone of apology and nuance lest someone think they haven't acknowledged the feelings of anyone who might be unhappy, the Bidenomics push has become positively triumphal. The common democratic impulse to make sure everyone's pain is validated has been set aside, at least for now. Instead, through Biden's speeches and a wave of media appearances by administration officials, the White House has gone on something of a victory tour. It's as though Democrats have finally realized how to frame a debate. If you want the press to tell everyone how great the economy is, you have to start by saying the economy is great. That doesn't mean all Americans will immediately be persuaded. The media's own skepticism remains, and news outlets will give Republicans ample time to continue claiming the economy is in desperate straits. But if nothing else, the idea that the economy is actually doing very well, how to judge that success, what produced it, how we might continue it, will move toward the center of the debate. Which means that debate will become very different from what it has been recently. A robust argument is underway among wonky liberals about just how good the economy is right now and whether Biden's approval on the economy deserves to be as low as it is. Meanwhile, in the financial press, the default mode seems to be to present every piece of good news with a warning not to let it brighten your day. Each month's report of job growth, and there have been an extraordinary 30 straight months of growth, is reported with headlines that say things like, hundreds of thousands of jobs added, but recession fears loom. As Timothy Noah of the New Republic puts it, to the business press, bad news is self-evidently bad, and good news is bad because markets or regulators will overreact and spoil everything. But look at the most commonly used economic indicators. Inflation has fallen to 4%, less than half what it was a year ago, and lower than in our peer countries. Unemployment is at just 3.6%. And on job growth, the results are nothing short of stunning. The most common objection at this point is that the president has a limited influence on job growth. This raises complicated questions, but when has that ever stopped a president before? When Ronald Reagan was airing soft focus ads touting "Morning in America" in 1984, unemployment was over 7%, and the American economy created a measly 5 million jobs during Reagan's first term. Yet Biden has seen the creation of more than 13 million jobs in the past 2.5 years. No president created that many over an entire 4-year term, going back as far as government data exist, to the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. However much importance you attach to those numbers, they certainly give the administration a strong case to make for Biden's economic stewardship. Yet his approval ratings on the economy remain absurdly low. There are a host of reasons for this, including polarization. When a Democrat is in the White House, almost no Republicans will tell pollsters things are going well, and possible lingering effects of inflation. But it's vital to remember that how people are doing and how they think the country is doing are not the same thing. And their judgment of the latter comes in large part from the news media. That's why it's possible for job satisfaction to be at its highest point in decades at the same time that poll respondents give the economy terrible ratings. In doing fine, many people seem to believe, but everyone else is struggling. When it comes to awareness of the economy, people have very little to go on from their individual lives. The media tells us what's happening in the country as a whole. And for much of Biden's term, the debate in the media has pitted Republicans saying that we're living through an economic catastrophe against Biden and his allies saying, a lot of people are suffering out there, we know it's bad, but we're making progress. Their fear of being seen as out of touch, or their fear of being scolded by participants in an elite debate that is invisible to most of the electorate, led them into the same kind of defensive crouch that characterizes Democrats on issues such as crime. Democrats have long believed that nothing would be worse than failing to acknowledge whatever pain people are feeling. The trouble with that is you end up talking a lot about what's bad, which only reinforces your opponent's claim that everything is bad. There's a communication theory called indexing, which holds that journalists frame debates around what key political figures say. If none of them are saying things are great, then the idea that things are great doesn't make it into the discussion. Yes, there are persistent problems of inequality and poverty, and we should explore and understand them. But it appears that the president and his administration have finally decided it's not their job to keep reminding us of everything about the economy that could be better. It's remarkable it took them so long. Given his barbarity so far, what if a vengeful Putin wins in Ukraine? What would happen if Russia were to regroup, dragoon and arm 1 million men, and prevail over even the increasingly well-armed Ukrainian military? Assume Vladimir Putin topples Volodymyr Zelensky and annexes the whole of Ukraine. What would happen to the Ukrainians? We know that at least 16,000 Ukrainian children have been abducted and spirited off to Russia for, we have to assume, assimilation into Putin's captive populations. At least 9,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed by the Russians and more than 15,000 wounded, according to the United Nations, which cautions that the true count is much higher. Catastrophic flooding has resulted from a dam almost certainly blown up by Russia. Countless civilian structures, including apartment buildings, have been targeted by Russian missiles. The Russian indifference to the dangers of conducting war around nuclear power plants has been demonstrated again and again. Of course, Putin also threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons as his invasion bogged down. So Russian war crimes have already been committed and more will undoubtedly come. But if Putin won, after losing tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine's fierce defenders, how would the Russian despot treat Ukraine's population of about 40 million? I fear he might subject them to quasi-enslavement if not genocide. This column is the third in a series about the importance of remembering the terrible past as a way of understanding the present, whether that means combating China's current attempts to memory hole its genocide against the Uyghur ethnic minority or reading about the Civil War to gain perspective on today's divisions among Americans, or about World War II to understand the implications of global threats today. Now I want to turn to what history tells us about how dictators treat subjugated peoples, as a way of showing what the stakes are in Russia's war against Ukraine. We know of monsters ghastly record over the past century. Joseph Stalin killed about 4 million Ukrainians with his forced collectivization of agriculture and the famine it triggered in 1932 to 1933. Adolf Hitler directed the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in the Holocaust. From 1958 to 1962, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward inflicted the worst mass murder in history, with a death count of about 45 million Chinese. Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia in the 1970s killed 1.7 million people. Other murderous regimes include Bashar al-Assad's in Syria over the past dozen years during a civil war, with the UN estimating a toll of more than 300,000 civilian victims of his bid to retain power. We cannot know what would happen if Putin prevailed in Ukraine, but the barbarity he has already employed is a valuable gauge. Consider that in American law, the idea of reasonable foreseeability is central to assigning liability for disastrous events. Tornadoes are not generally considered foreseeable, and neither are earthquakes. But slip and falls on wet floors in department stores are foreseeable. So is the danger posed by a drunk driver. Liability is hard to assign for acts of God but relatively easy, if expensive to insure against, when disasters are predictable. Foreseeable events can bring judgments of guilt, responsibility, liability for damages or imprisonment. With Putin's character well known and the examples of the past century squarely in front of us, isn't there a reasonable foreseeability that he would embark on a vengeful mass murder campaign if he took Ukraine? Such a horror would not surprise me. It shouldn't surprise anyone if it comes to pass. In the aftermath, politicians and commentators should not be able to plead shock or disgust at what transpired. Putin butchering his defeated foes, hunting down every soldier in the Ukrainian military, all of that and more is predictable. As the Nazis, the Soviets and the Chinese Communist Party have acted, so we must assume Putin would act. Which is why the West must continue to aid Ukraine militarily, with everything short of troops in combat. We know what could follow if Ukraine is defeated. We ought to be repelled by the prospect of complicity. The West must provide the weapons Ukraine needs to survive. Far from being too much to ask, it is the obligation of the civilized world to stop yet another horror from being added to the list of infamies above.